Hey there, thanks so much for tuning in for the Drawing for Adults class. My name is Payton Cook and I teach these classes at the Ann Arbor District Library. This class is offered as a partnership between the library and the Ann Arbor Art Center, both located in Ann Arbor. And we normally do this class in person, as you may know, but because of these current times, we are doing these classes online, and so we're in the middle of a watercolor and ink series. If you haven't checked those out, I would encourage you to do so, and today's topic is on texture and fur. So today we're talking about texture, and we're going to be talking about texture in terms of fur, and we're going to be using watercolor and ink to create a mixed media work of art that really emphasizes texture. So I want to first just address, what is the definition of texture? What are the different types of texture that we see in art? And then what are we going to be doing with it today? So texture is one of the 7 elements of art. If you're not familiar with the elements of art, it's one of, like I said, 7 different things that we use in art, and the other ones, for example, are space and shape, line, color, value, form, I think is the other one I didn't say, and then of course texture. So these are things that we use often in art, and they're really important that you try to include them, at least most of them, in a work of art, and at least consider it, even if you choose not to, but maybe have a really intentional reason why you're choosing not to incorporate the elements or all the elements of art, or some of them, or whatever. So texture is one of the 7 elements of art, and it refers to the surface quality of an artwork. Now, when I say surface qualities, that just means basically what does it feel like if you were to touch it? So rough, smooth, matte, glossy, impasto. There's so many different ways that, of course, a surface can feel. Now, when we have texture, we have 2D texture and we have 3D texture. So I'm going to actually skip over here to the right before addressing the 2D texture, because 2D texture gets a little bit more complicated. So 3D texture, I think, is really plain and simple as far as conceptually to understand this. It basically just means physical texture that can be physically touched and felt. So if you rubbed your hand over a canvas, let's just say, that has 3D texture, then you would literally feel it. It's a tactile kind of quality, so it would be bumpy or whatever it is, right? Versus 2D texture. So 2D texture is flat, and it's the visual texture. It's the illusion of how an object would feel if it could be touched. So we have 2 different types of textures in this 2D realm. So simulated texture is when the texture imitates the real life texture, okay? This is, for the most part, probably what you're going to be focusing on today. So it's texture that imitates the real life texture. So that means that it looks as if it's real. It's painted to look like it actually is that real life texture. Let's think of a basketball, for example. All those little pips or whatever they're called, it's not the actual, there's not little teeny tiny bumps on my painting that you would actually be able to, physically feel. If you rubbed your hand over the surface of the canvas, it would indeed be flat. But it is painted to look as if, or drawn of course, to look as if it is actually bumpy. So that's simulated texture. Now, invented texture is a little different. This is a very different kind of texture, but we often refer to, this is why texture can get confusing, but we often refer to a lot of paintings as having a lot of texture, but it's not physical texture, and it's not it doesn't look like it's the actual texture of the object I'm painting, for example. And invented texture is when you use a variety of repeated shapes, values, and lines. And so the artist is kind of making it up. So I'm going to show you examples of what these mean to help you understand these a little bit more, because I think it can be confusing, but of course having a visual in front of us really, really helps. So here we go. I'm going to actually skip that, but this is a great video to look at elements of art. I'm not going to play it, but if you wanted to look at it later, it's from this art school, KQED. So I recommend looking it up for some more information. But I'm going to skip that for now. Well, I'm going to skip it. You can look at it later yourself. I'm not going to play a video within the video. I'm not sure how well the quality would look. But anyway, here's an example of this simulated texture. Okay, so this is the 2D texture. Simulated texture, meaning these paintings, believe it or not, some of these are really unbelievable that they are this way, especially this one on the left, I believe. But these are all painted, of course, to look real. It looks like the actual texture of the objects, but they are indeed all flat. So if you rubbed your hand over the surface of all these pieces of paper, papers or canvases, it would be completely flat and smooth, just the texture, of course, of the paper or canvas. So this is simulated texture, so painted or drawn to look like the real texture of the objects. Another 2D texture example is this invented texture. So you can see hopefully in these representations how the use of shapes and values and colors and lines and all of that is really used to create a different kind of texture. So we would refer to this, and you've probably seen artwork that you've been like, wow, that has a lot of texture, but it doesn't have that same kind of, physical texture, or it's not painted to look real, right? Like these aren't really painted to look real or drawn. But it still has that variety, that movement, that rhythm, all of those things, and that kind of gives it that idea of invented texture. All right, and then lastly, we have the 3D texture, which is the physical texture. So all of these works of art here, I believe they're all paintings, oh my goodness, I look at these and I just want to touch them, right? There is, on all of these, you could just imagine the kind of sort of rough, textured, see, I said textured to describe texture, but that's okay, surface that they have, right? It has this very physical, tactile quality to them, all of these images here. All right, so those are the different examples of different textures. I hope that's helpful in understanding kind of the difference between 2D texture and the differences between what different kinds of 2D textures we have, along with the 3D texture, having this physical texture. So like I mentioned before, we're gonna focus on 2D texture, but specifically in that simulated texture. So where we're drawing something to kind of look pretty real, though it's going to be with watercolor and ink. And so there's a little bit of, kind of a playfulness that we're going to really experiment with today as far as line work and colors and just letting those two things kind of come together. So it's not going to necessarily be the most realistic artwork. At least my example won't be. It's, will be okay. You can push yours as far as you want, get really, really detailed. I would be making a video that probably lasts several hours if I really wanted to. I would time lapse it, of course, but still, it would be really lengthy. So feel free to push this as far as you want to go, as far as to, how simulated, how realistic you want to get it. But anyway, so this is just a little bit of info about the texture before we jump into the drawing portion. Alright, so this is going to be the end result of today's drawing, and so this is a combination of watercolor and ink, but what I actually want you to start off with is just a pencil sketch. So get to know your subject matter is going to be the best way to approach this, because I think that drawing fur is really tricky. I think that drawing an animal is really tricky, and most likely if you're drawing fur, it's probably some kind of animal. You do not have to draw the exact same thing as me. To be completely honest with you, drawing animals is not something I do that frequently, so you're gonna see some adjustments here, a lot of erasing in this video, so definitely bear with me as I approach a subject matter that is something that I am not, it's not something I practice a lot in my studio practice. So this is me, and also me encouraging you as well to just get to know your subject matter, get to know the animal, the critter, whatever it is that you want to draw, whether that's a wolf or a cat or a tiny hamster. It doesn't matter what it is. I would recommend really just sketching it out first in pencil so that you have that room to make mistakes. You can erase, you can make changes, and it just will help you feel a lot more comfortable going into this. So that's what I'm starting off with. That's what you're seeing here. You can also see as I'm doing this, I'm also sketching in some really wispy fur marks. I'm looking at the way that the shadows of the fur, like those darker spaces and places that they kind of create here, and these spots, and so you can see me really darkening up those areas, but also kind of taking some out, erasing it, adjusting that little mouth line there. You can see I had that pretty far off at the beginning, and so I'm just making these adjustments. Also, now I need to make the head a lot taller and fluffier back there, so I'm also kind of making some adjustments there. But look at your subject matter and look at the different ways that that you can really improve in your sketching skills. I am doing a little bit more than a sketch here. You can see I'm really adding a lot of shading and adding in a little bit more detail, but this really helps because one of the things I'm doing as I'm sketching this is I'm looking at the direction of the fur. So you can see here in the front, it's kind of curving more towards the left, I guess, whereas the back part of the fur is going more diagonally, just horizontally, I guess, diagonally towards the right. So it's really important to kind of get to know what you're drawing. So now I feel more comfortable doing that, to take that same starting point of a sketch, and I can still do all of this in pencil. You can sketch out as much as you want in pencil. If you didn't shade in a lot, you could even just take that sketch and go ahead and draw over it with your ink pen. Now, if you aren't familiar with ink pens, I would recommend grabbing something that, if you have a couple different pens that you can use that are dark, bold lines, but then also some that are finer point, I think that you'll really like that. And so it's also important to grab something that's archival and waterproof. If you don't have that as an option, then I definitely wouldn't do what I'm doing right now, which is kind of switching back and forth between watercolor and ink. If your pen is not waterproof, which test it out first on a scrap sheet of paper to find out, just draw something in ink and then trace or paint over it with your watercolor. And you'll find out if it bleeds or not and spreads and you lose all of your marks. That would be super sad. So if you do have a pen that is not waterproof, then you're going to want to do the whole watercolor application first and let that dry and then draw on top of it. Make sure, no matter what pen you're using, that your watercolor painting is fully dry before you go on to the next part. That is going to be extremely important. Otherwise, you will completely ruin your pens and it'll be really sad. So make sure that everything that you're painting is dry before moving on. Okay, so you can see here with the watercolor application here, I didn't put a ton of detail in at this point. And this is enough though where I can see, okay, here's my variations in lights and darks, as well as some other colors too. But as you can see, I'm adding in a lot of detail around the eye right now with my pen itself. And so that's really where I'm going to get most of my detail in. I'm not really that worried about having the fluffiest defined watercolor painting. I'm just kind of putting that in as background. Honestly, I think mine is pretty defined. So if yours is more blobby and it doesn't look as defined as mine, that's okay. It doesn't really matter. Most of our detail, similar to the other watercolor and ink series that we've been doing the past couple of weeks, and if you haven't checked those out, I would encourage you to do so. I think they're really great. It's just a way to explore this subject or these materials a little bit more with watercolor and ink, but with different subject matter. So this is where it's really helpful that I had that sketch before starting this, because I already know the direction that the fur is supposed to go. And so this is really helpful. I'm also really paying attention to the length of the fur. So closer to the eye and that nose area, those little bits of fur are so tiny and short. Whereas over here, kind of right behind the face into the neck, it's a little bit longer, but then getting more towards where the back here would be, it's significantly longer. And so I'm able to draw these kind of wispy looking lines to represent the length of the fur, depending on, of course, how long it's supposed to be. All right, so I'm just gonna keep adding a little bit more details. Feel free to follow along or draw whatever you're drawing during this time. I'm not gonna time lapse it more than what I'm doing at this speed right now, just because I don't want to lose anything important, but I'll pick back up and start talking again in just a moment. All right, so now for the fun part. I've gotten my ink drawing in, so now I'm gonna go back and add some fun colors with my watercolor. Now, this would be something that you would wanna do, of course, if you don't have archival waterproof ink, you'd wanna do this beforehand, but I just wanna push my colors a little further, add more contrast, add some like purples and other colors that you don't really think that really would normally belong necessarily in a painting or a drawing of a wolf. So I'm adding in some extra details. Now some of these are white lines, which you can see would be a little bit harder to do, or maybe is not necessarily harder, but not as traditional to do with watercolors. I say do what you want to do. If you don't love the idea of using white watercolors, a lot of artists, watercolor artists don't. In fact, I normally don't, but in this case, I just wanted to add a little bit more texture. You could also use, I've seen a lot of artists here lately that are using white gel pens, for example, and their artwork. And I think that anything really is fine to use. It's not, I don't see why I'm gonna all of a sudden create some kind of rule or expectation of what you can and cannot use. So I want you to be creative and have a space to just feel free to do what you want to do here. So I'm realizing I have messed up the nose. Like I said, there's a learning curve here, so there's some adjustments that I have to make. So that's kind of what you just saw there, and then I'm just like, okay, this is going to be a lot. Let me go back in and add a little bit more detail into the fur before going on and trying to fix the nose. So now I'm going back in and trying to fix that part, so you can see I'm looking at a reference photo, by the way. I should have mentioned that before. Definitely pull up a picture of whatever animal you're wanting to draw and use that as your reference. If you have an animal at home that stays still for a long amount of time, then you can definitely obviously use a live reference as well. Here I'm putting in the whiskers. But a photo reference obviously is going to stay still the longest for you. You don't have to worry about it walking away like most other live subjects. So definitely make sure you're using a good quality reference photo. It's not something you have to print out, but you don't have to have a hard copy, but it's having something to look at. I am just looking at a picture on my phone while I'm doing this, and obviously it's pretty small, but it still works. So anyway, have fun with this, and I hope you tune in next week.